Here's just a quick question. Like, what's the difference between PTSD and just trauma itself? We were kind of chatting about this before we got started, and I hear the word PTSD a lot these days. But without being like officially diagnosed, I don't know what that means. So what are your thoughts on like the difference between the two?
Yeah, now I'm not a psychologist, so I'm going to draw information. My background actually is a doctor of chiropractic, but working in the field with physical trauma for decades, and then moving into this work of more psycho-emotional trauma. You have to realize that, for example, the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, there are criteria. For example, you had to have had a trauma, and you've had to have symptoms related to that trauma for at least 1 month. You start to look at different signs and symptoms. There's kind of a checklist of continually re-experiencing the event, like having intrusive thoughts that are related to the trauma. Those intrusive thoughts may be coming in through the nighttime, like as in nightmares or distressing dreams. Involuntary memories coming forward. It could be as far as flashbacks, dissociation or separation from oneself and one's feelings, feeling numb, being, for example, having avoidance behaviors to avoid anything that might remind you of it. You can have lots of arousal, which means you may not sleep, or you feel like you're constantly on edge and constantly looking around you. You may have times that it cycles between, for example, being very aroused and then being totally numb and checked out. So, there's a lot of different aspects to actually have a trauma. In other words, I just want to say to have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is different than trauma, because trauma is at the heart of the diagnosis, but many people experience trauma but don't develop PTSD. Mm-hmm. So often that word is kind of bounced around a lot when people are meaning I'm having effects from the trauma, but it's not necessarily reaching that clinical level of PTSD. And I also want to make the distinction that when we experience a significant trauma, it is very typical to have post-traumatic stress, right? That's very common and very normal. But given our history especially, are we resilient enough to resolve and move forward, make meaning, have that dissipate within a month, or does it persist? Do we remain at that level of arousal, that post-traumatic stress that stays and remains and continues in the way that I was saying, and then requires, because of lack of stability in one's life, it starts to affect one's relationships with spouse and family, ability to hold a job, ability to sleep, all of those things then start to move us into PTSD.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. I appreciate that distinction. I just anticipate a lot of people are coming to this event, obviously either having the diagnosis or having had trauma, but not necessarily being diagnosed. And I just want everybody to know that this event is for all of you, no matter what, because obviously these techniques are going to help with those,
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. And, to be honest, I don't know anybody that in their life hasn't experienced trauma. Now, that varies significantly. And in fact, it's interesting because recent studies have shown that sometimes PTSD comes from a single event. Okay. However, when we start to look at, for example, especially in military culture, et cetera, the diagnosis may have been right after a singular event, but there is a tremendous preponderance of that there was previous trauma before that single event, often childhood, that then kind of primed the pump for which this singular event or witnessing or experiencing physically, et cetera, then sent it into PTSD. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's very common. So whenever, I speak with somebody about a diagnosis of PTSD, I don't think I've ever spoken with anybody that didn't have, for example, earlier childhood trauma that in a sense wired their system that made it more vulnerable and less resilient to that more significant single impacted event. Mm-hmm. But if it happens, for example, in childhood, and we start to have recurrent, repeated trauma, and we start to move into something called complex PTSD, then we're starting to talk about really kind of a whole different bailiwick there.
So like what, yeah, I've been talking with people about that, like the difference between those. So complex is like repeated kinds of traumas in your life. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's a continual recurrence. It's not singular, and it's almost always, so there's, I guess if, we can draw it into, there is PTSD. That could be from a singular event. There's complex PTSD, that's with a recurring situation. And then there's complex developmental, which means that it was recurring while the nervous system and body and brain were developing, childhood, etc. And so they're all PTSD, but they have a different impact because, as the tree grows, so to speak, if you bend a tree when it's young and it continues to grow in that direction, it has a greater significant effect on the whole of somebody's life and the way they experience the world and themselves than if it happened as a singular adult experience, which does not minimize in any way the adult trauma. It just, it sits differently in the way that the brain and body are wired.